Hello, I'm Joel McLeod.
And I'm Roland Tanner.
And welcome back to the 905er. At the start of August, we said we'd be taking the month off to regroup, re-energize, and return fresh to talk about what's important to the 905. Instead, we got a federal election. And yes, I admit I falsely predicted that we would not be in one. But I'll save all of that for a future episode. Right now, we want to talk politics. More importantly, what are the big political issues that are important to the 905 region, and what are the main political parties doing or ought to be doing to address them? Off the bat, one of the major issues of this campaign is housing reform, a topic many listeners of this podcast know is a passion of Roland's and myself. However, instead of dissecting the party platforms line by line, we thought, let's go above the spin. Let's get right into the topic and figure out what exactly is the issue and what should we be doing about it, regardless of our political affiliation. And this is what we want to do for this election. Not just talk about party platforms and candidates, although we will. We also want to talk about the issues and hopefully educate you and us on what we should be doing and what we should be looking for in terms of leadership on these issues. We are hoping that over time we can educate you to be a little bit more critical of the party's platforms and help you hold these candidates to the fire. In that light, we asked back to the podcast Mike Moffat. Mike is an economist who has done groundbreaking research into the reasons why housing, not just the 905, but the entire country, is currently running wild. He knows what the causes of the rapid price increases and what ought to be done to keep housing affordable. More importantly, we want to know, why is this such an issue? We hope you have a listen, and I hope that you come across a little bit more informed to help you make a better choice in this election. Have a listen. Here we are, back to record after we thought we'd have a full month off, but then the government had to go and call an election, so now we're back. And we are glad to welcome back to the podcast Mike Moffat, who is a expert, or as close to an expert as we can get onto the podcast in terms of the housing issue that is becoming one of the main themes of this election. So we're glad to have Mike back to talk about his expertise and his knowledge in this field. And Mike, thanks for coming back to us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
The reason why we want to have you on was, of course, as I just said, housing prices is crept into the national conversation, and seems to be one of the major issues. Every party has come out with their in their platform with some way to tackle the housing crisis. Rather than go into each platform line by line, because I don't think that's what our listeners really want to hear. What I'd rather have is if you could kind of inform our listeners in terms of what exactly is going on in, I'm surprising, not just the 905, but the entire country. Like, can you kind of give us a lay of the land of what we're seeing housing prices happening from Pacific to Atlantic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to start before the pandemic. So let's go to about 2016 or so. Ontario, particularly both 416, 905, Toronto had rather rapid population growth due to a variety of factors, immigration growth, the big boom in international students. We became a much more attractive destination after the election of President Trump. A lot of international talent said we want to be in Canada instead of the U.S. So we got an influx of some really talented 20-somethings who liked what we had to offer and wanted to stay. And that's, been very good for our economy. But what happened was we didn't really change the way or the rate at which we built homes. So starting in about 2016, across Southern Ontario, it seemed that for every home that went onto the market, there would be 2 or 3 bidders, right? Which would, cause these prices to go up, and whoever wins the house is usually whoever can make the highest bid. So, and we saw these housing shortages start in Toronto and then propagate out to Kitchener-Waterloo, and by about 2017-18, secondary markets like Brantford and Woodstock and even Tillsonburg in London were absolutely booming. Okay, then we had the pandemic, and for a while, the housing market actually corrected itself a little bit for about 6 weeks because of a slowdown in international students and international talent that was coming to Canada. But that quickly changed. And the reason why it changed was, first of all, people got stuck in their houses. And oftentimes they're like, well, I don't want to be in this 600 square foot condo if I'm working from home anyway. So I want a bigger house. So they go out and start buying houses. You get people, 30% of the population I call white collar professionals are doing really well financially, don't know where to put their money. So they're like, I'm going to buy an investment property. I'm going to buy a second home as an investment property. So we've seen the value of everything from stocks to Bitcoin to old hockey cards are all going up, driven by white collar people with too much money. And then finally, this big drop in interest rates allows people to make bigger bids, right? Just because they're lowers the monthly payments. So now you've got, instead of 3 bidders for every home, you've got 4 or 5. And then those increased savings and lower interest rates allows them to make bigger bids. So across Canada, we're seeing prices go up. And in some markets in Southern Ontario in particular, we're seeing prices go up 40, 50%. And we're also seeing prices go up in a lot of markets you wouldn't think would normally be that attractive, like rural New Brunswick or Cape Breton out in Nova Scotia. And again, a lot of that's driven by if I'm working from home, why don't I go out and live by the ocean instead of a 600 square foot condo in downtown Toronto? And, there's no reason to be here. And I can't go see the Raptors anyway because, they're playing down in Florida. So that, it's a long-winded answer, but it's basically, we had a weird market before the pandemic, and then we just threw gasoline on that fire, or at least gasoline was thrown on that fire by a number of different factors.
Do you think, Mike, that this is going to... Do you think we're looking at a permanent change? I mean, from what I understand anecdotally from friends and relatives and so on, a lot of people are not going back to work in the way that they worked before. So, do you think this is going away anytime soon, or is this here for good? 'Cause it's not like things were cheap before.
It's not like things were cheap before. And I think, one of the things I think a lot of people have in the back of their heads is the only time in a sort of living memory where we've seen anything approaching this was the late 1980s in the GTA and parts of Southern Ontario. And that market corrected, and it corrected pretty hard. So, you go, okay, is history going to repeat itself, and are we going to see a 30 to 40% drop? Keeping in mind that if prices drop about 30%, that just brings us back to where they were in 2020, which were still really expensive. But there are reasons to believe that might not necessarily happen. And in fact, prices could stay at this level or continue to rise somewhat. They're not going to rise at 40% continually, but they still could stay at this level or go up. Reasons being, if the international students come back at high rates, we've increased our immigration targets. Interest rates are probably going to go up, but they don't look like, if you look at 10, long-term bond yields, they're not projected to go up that fast, that quickly. So a lot of these demand drivers are going to be there. Continue. Now, I think you are going to see, I think there are going to be some permanent changes due to work from home. I think sort of ex-urban locations, again, like your Brantfords and Tillsonburgers and so on, that price jump is probably permanent, right? A lot of people are going, you know what, I like having this half acre. I'm going to continue working out there. So I think one of the permanent changes we might see is not quite the huge disparity between Toronto prices and Woodstock prices or Owen Sound prices or so on. We might see somewhat of a flattening of the market where Toronto remains relatively soft, but all of these other markets continue to catch up to it a little bit.
On that note, I mean, that sounds great if you're living in Toronto, I guess, and you're thinking, okay, my housing market's going to kind of I can manage that. However, I mean, I have family that lives out near Tillsonburg, Simcoe area. Wages and salaries have not met that jump in housing pricing. And as you said earlier, in rural New Brunswick and Cape Breton and rural Saskatchewan are seeing these gigantic increases far outside what normal people would be able to kind of plan or buffer for it. So that brings me to my question of, this sounds like it is really a national emergency when we kind of have this runaway train of housing pricing increases that, quite frankly, a lot of people might be priced out of housing affordability. Can you maybe kind of give us the bit of the doom and gloom, I guess, in terms of why? Well, I mean, this has become a national, a campaign issue, and people are really dissecting the party's plans on this. And I'm just wondering, maybe kind of put into context for our leaders, just why exactly is it important that we really address this issue?
Yeah, so I think there's a few important things going on. So local affordability is a big one. It absolutely is. And this was an issue, again, before the pandemic and now more so, that a lot of times what's happening in these markets in Southern Ontario is you get people who are working in the GTA, earning GTA-type salaries, but then moving to a Woodstock, to a Tillsonburg, to a Brantford, and bidding up house prices, which makes those markets unaffordable to people earning Brantford wages. And we're seeing this. We're seeing a lot of people who work in Toronto move to London, but we're also seeing this out movement in London, sometimes to St. Thomas, which isn't that far away, but now we're seeing families move to Sarnia or Chatham, Kent, which are significantly cheaper, though who knows how long that will last, but then having to commute back to London. So we're getting this real disconnect that people are, we're getting a higher proportion of the population, again, particularly in Southern Ontario, who work in one city and earn wages in one city, but live in another one, which for people that work from home, that's not too bad. But a lot of our teachers, nurses, or so on, you're still working in a location. So it's increasing commutes, it's putting stresses on the environment. One of the big concerns that I have, so at SPI, I mean, we're in an environmental economic think tank, is that right now housing is getting built where it's being allowed to be built. And right now, the easiest place to build housing is in smaller communities. So you get all of which is good for some of those communities. But we're losing 175 acres of farmland every day to developments. We're losing our forested areas. It's like, yes, we have the greenbelt area protected, but we still have a lot of forested areas that are becoming developments because it's so hard to build within cities right now. And I do worry in the long run that this is going to put the greenbelt at risk, that, we can't price out an entire generation at owning a home. I mean, that's just not politically and economically sustainable, particularly if we want to maintain the greenbelt. Because after a while, 20-somethings are going to look and say, well, I can't, there's nowhere for me to have a home. Why don't we just build some homes over there where those wetlands are? After a while, the political pressures to start paving over the greenbelt are just going to be too strong. And I wouldn't blame people. People need somewhere to live, and people want to own a house as a form of security. They don't have to worry about rent evictions, and as a way to, save for the retirement. So, other generations have been able to do that, and we're going to have to make sure that this generation is able to as well.
So, I mean, I guess then there's two related sides to this. There's the affordability of actual home ownership, and then there's the affordability of, obviously, Joel and I are both based in Burlington. Mm-hmm. Well known that anybody under 30 is probably going to have to move to Hamilton. If you're leaving home, if you just come back from college, you're not going to be living in Burlington because there's nowhere to rent. The rent is pricey. And you certainly can't afford to buy anything. So there's that whole side of things too. And I guess the more important part of my question is this something that actually, is it simply a supply and demand thing that we just need to free up the market to do its thing? Or is it somewhere where the government can, and should it be the federal government, actually intervene and make a significant change?
Yeah, so So at one level, I mean, it is a supply and demand thing, right? But we have to understand that the housing market is so far from a traditional laissez-faire market. I mean, it is so dictated by rules and regulate, and it should be. I mean, we need to protect the environment, and we need to create affordability. But right now, I would argue we have the worst of both worlds, right? I think we have like the worst of the central planning world, where we have chronic shortages, and people waiting in queues, et cetera, but also the worst of the capitalist world, where you have a elite land owning aristocracy that's getting all the sort of benefits from this. So it is right in terms of reform. Now, there's a lot that the federal government can do on the sort of who's winning these bids. What's the price? What's the price of the winning bid? What's the transparency around bids and so on? And that's through mortgage stress tests, doing things around foreign buyers, vacancy taxes, and so on. But none of that really changes the dynamic of three buyers for every seller, right? They can change what the winning bid is and things around that, but that dynamic they can't directly change. That's mostly, I would say, municipal regulations and some provincial rules around it. That said, the one thing that the federal government does have is cash. And cash solves a lot of problems if you spend it wisely. And then secondly, the municipalities have a big issue on the horizon that they're painfully aware of, is the fact that the decline in brick and mortar retail due to shop at home, coupled with the decline in commercial real estate due to work at home, is really going to stretch municipal budgets. They're in kind of a world of hurt. So what the federal government can do is use its spending power to basically buy reforms at the municipal level through either a carrots or sticks approach. And I know we're not going to get too much into policy planks, but one of the things that the conservatives talk about in their platform is that the federal government gives a lot of money to municipality for transit projects that they would put in requirements as saying, okay, if we're going to give you this much money for a subway, or here in Ottawa, the O train, you've got to make sure that you develop medium and high density housing along those lines, or otherwise we're not going to give you that money. So
but
they
could you not say, sorry, I mean, I'm jumping in there just because
go ahead.
Point that struck me on that when I saw that, which is, but don't we already do that? I mean, there's, if the transit, again, I'm using Burlington because I live here. In Burlington is closely tied to where the density has to go according to, now that's Ontario. I don't know what the other provinces do, but can saying you've got to build by the transit have any effect when we're already building by transit?
Well, I would say that we're not necessarily in some areas. I can use Ottawa as an example. I mean, we're supposed to be building medium and high density along those lines, but it's just not happening for a variety of reasons in some specific areas. And it's all, I'm sure it's all the stuff you guys have talked about before, some, local opposition, different zoning rules or things like that. So you're right. I mean, we do this to a certain extent. It's just, what are you going to make the rules, and how stringently are you going to enforce them? When are you going to give the money? Do you have to build that housing first before the money flows? So there's a lot of things you can do there. There's also, and that's more of a sticks approach, there's also a carrots approach you can take. One of the things I would love to see is a federal government go to municipalities and say, hey, look, we want you to build more medium and high density downtown, but we also recognize that that's going to increase your transit costs, right? Because in part, we're trying to get people to out of their cars and take the O train, take the subway, what have you, and that's going to increase your costs. So if you make that easier to do, and that could be like specific, like we want X number of houses, Or it could be things like, we know one of the issues preventing medium and high density housing from getting built is parking minimums. So if you take the approach Edmonton has taken to eliminate parking minimums on medium and high density, we will compensate you for that with additional gas tax funds or something like that. And I think that would be particularly attractive to municipalities where that money that's basically operating capital is not tied to a specific project. So there are some creative levers that the federal government can do, but it's basically you're incenting reform. You're not actually doing the reforms yourself because you can't. You just don't have you don't have those really hyper local policy levers at the federal level.
This is something we talked about just before we hit record. This federal election, this is an issue. Every party has come out with a plan one way or the other. However, a lot of this does come down to at the municipal level. We have zoning plans. You do have, you have to deal with local opposition to, you want to build a condo here or housing development there, et cetera. And there's also the provincial level where you have to take into account, the zoning. Like we were talking here in Ontario, the current provincial government is going on an MZO kick with, ministerial zoning orders to reshape development lands. We're not going to get into that, but there's a when we talk like a national housing strategy, we kind of just stop at the federal level, which, as he says, just like, hey, we're going to throw however hundreds of millions of dollars into building affordable housing, which is good, great, like that. But is it a strategy? And I guess my question is, why is it that we look to the federal government to solve this issue? When, in my mind, I'm thinking we need to talk to all three and actually have kind of all three come to an actual commission or a summit or something to say, we need agreement. All 10 provinces using their powers to influence the municipalities to say, we need to solve this. Yeah. And I don't see that coming forward from any federal party in terms of that we're going to take that level of leadership on to get this thing solved.
Yeah, so I think you're right that this is going to take all three levels of government, and I would say that this is going to work as well as the weakest link in the chain, right? That whatever government is level of government is screwing up the policy, that's basically how well this will work. So I do think there's a big role for the federal government, but I would hate to be in the situation that people now think, oh, okay, well, this is a federal government issue, and we leave the provinces off the hook, or we leave municipalities off the hook. I desperately hope that we are talking about this in the next provincial election. If we're not, something has gone wrong. So that's an absolutely. I think things need to be at the provincial and municipal level, and I would particularly argue that more so, the municipalities get a lot of attention, as they should, but I actually think the province is probably the more important link here. And the reason is that it's hard. There's so much, particularly in Ontario, there's so many spillover effects of what happens in one municipality affects another, and people moving from one municipality to another because of drive until you qualify, where it's like, okay, people are just moving where housing is cheap. It makes it really hard for municipal government to create affordability in their community. So you guys mentioned Hamilton. Let's suppose Hamilton really said, okay, we're going to eliminate minimum parking. We're going to change a bunch of zoning regulations. We're going to do this and that, and because we want housing to be affordable in Hamilton. Well, all they're really, that's all helpful, and it will help somewhat, but that's also going to cause a huge influx of families from Burlington and Toronto, right? So it's you've got all of these sort of spillover effects that no one municipality, other than maybe the city of Toronto itself, can really put a huge dent in this. But where the province can come in is, and this won't be entirely popular with municipalities, but again, it could set sort of minimum baselines, or it could say, okay, you know what, municipal governments in the GTA, we're going to eliminate. I keep going to parking minimums just because it's an easy one to understand, but we're going to eliminate parking minimums in every municipality within the Golden Horseshoe. Something like that would make a real difference. But because it's just so hard to solve this thing at a single municipal level, because it just creates so much in and out migration.
Just on that subject of parking minimums, actually, perhaps you could, because I'm fairly familiar with it, but I'm guessing a lot of our listeners would not be familiar and may think, well, that's crazy. We've got to have places to park, right? How would you eliminate parking minimums and hope to have a good result? So what is the argument behind that, and why could it possibly be so transformative?
Yeah, absolutely. So parking minimums is basically like if you're building a high rise or your medium or density housing sort of downtown, you need to have X number of parking spaces per unit, right? And that's a minimum, right? You can go above that, that's fine, but you're basically mandate to builders how many parking spaces that they have. Well, what that causes is first of all that you need to build that parking, and that takes up space. But secondly, it also limits the sort of size you can make these places simply because it's like, okay, well, I'm limited by the number of parking spaces I can do. But if what we're trying to do, particularly in downtown locations, is incent people to take transit, it's a little bit backwards to say, okay, but yeah, we want everyone to use transit, and we're going to build a high rise on a subway line, but we're still going to have the same parking requirements as we would, if this was on the outskirts of the city. It simply doesn't make any sense. So what you can do is either reduce or eliminate those parking minimums. That's not the same thing as saying we're going to eliminate parking. What it's going to say is we're going to let the builders choose, right? And we're going to basically let market forces dictate this. That if people want parking in their condo, in their apartment, or what have you, then that will kind of show up in rents, and then people can go, okay, well, am I going to rent or own a condo that's slightly cheaper and I don't have parking, or am I going to pay for the more expensive one where I'm guaranteed a spot? But ultimately, you're letting people choose instead of the government sort of dictating their parking preferences on everyone. So again, it's really important to understand that this is not banning parking. Just the opposite. It's letting the builder of a project or the designer of the project put in the level of parking that they deem appropriate.
It makes me, and this is just a side point. Sorry, Joel. It makes me laugh quite often that politicians who in other walks of life will be talking about let the market decide, when it comes to anything that affects cars, suddenly have a very socialist outlook on life. But that's just, sorry, Joel, you go ahead.
I kind of would take it back a step from parking. And I'm wondering if our the kind of leadership that we should be seeing on this issue, we should be talking a bit about trying to change the dynamic of this conversation. All this episode, we've been talking about housing. And I think what that conveys to most people is, 4 walls and a roof, the detached home, white picket fence, the stereotypical family dwelling. And we've also been talking about the need to preserve, the green belt and green space. And what we haven't really talked about really is density, and the need to better utilize the space that we already have. And I'm wondering, should we be shifting the conversation from a housing strategy to more of a home strategy? And by that, I mean including more rental options and securing rental rights for people who say, I might not be able to afford a home, but I need to secure that I have a place to live, and to maybe incentivize building more rental options for families and kind of the amenities that go along with that. What do you think about that as a general concept to helping address this issue?
Yeah, I think we need all of that. And again, this is where I have fear that these conversations are kind of either or, right? It's like, okay, we do this or we do that, and we need both. I mean, we need more. We certainly need more purpose-built rentals. And I almost don't I think in some issue, I don't think the issue is whether or not to incent these, because a lot of times, the incentive's there, right? There's so much market demand out there. The issue is that we can't build these things for a variety of reasons. Again, parking minimum is one, but there's a bunch of other things on it. So I'll give you a density example. So I'm in Ottawa right now, in a neighborhood called the Glebe. It's kind of like Cabbage Town. It's a lot of somewhat well-off homeowners who like things the way they are, and we have rules to sort of protect that. But again, these rules are kind of perverse, right? So, for instance, we can only have, or at least in most of it, we can only have single detached homes, right? I can't build, like, if I decided tomorrow that, what I would really like to do is tear this thing down and build a duplex. I can't do it. I just can't do it under the zoning regulations. But even if I wanted to keep it and it's about 100-year-old neighborhood, even if I wanted to keep it like 100 years old, like looking the same way at a place, like you couldn't even tell it was a duplex. Doesn't matter. We can't do it because it would change the character of the neighborhood. But on the other hand, if I want to tear this place down and put up a complete eyesore that is not anything looking like any of the buildings around me, I can do that. Nobody can stop me. So we have these rules designed to keep the character of the neighborhood, but they don't actually do that because they allow you to design things that are completely out of character, but also prevent you from building duplexes and triplexes, which would fit in really well with the neighborhood if they were designed correctly. So it's stuff like that where, there are these options here. And, we should keep in mind when we talk about densifying our cities, that's, there's all of this missing middle. Like, it doesn't have to be single detached homes or, 60-story high rises. There's a lot of things we could be doing, and they're just not legal. And to go to Roland's point, and it's a lot of the sort of small c conservative politicians who say, well, no, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, this is my land, like but you're saying that no, government should be dictating all of this. So it does create some really weird political dynamics. And it's more sort of conservatism in the sense of not changing things rather than conservatism and sort of giving people the liberty to make the choices that make sense for them.
And I feel part of the problem with, and I have a thing about the word NIMBYism, which people who know me know about, but I feel that in a lot of ways we have created a situation that encourages NIMBYism because we said, okay, downtown density, yeah, everybody's in favor of it. You won't find any politician who is officially against it, or very few. However, we've said, this is where we want people to build. But this area over here, which is right next door, which is all lawns and dog walking, is completely untouchable still. And if the street is built, and then the street is built, and that's the maximum. And like you say, I mean, on my street, since I moved in, there's been a huge amount of development happening, but the number of people living on the street is the same or possibly lower than it was the year I came here. But the houses are twice as big. And that seems to me, an absolute core foundational problem that we have with the way zoning works in, the whole of North America, really. I mean, it's we're putting the pressure, the objectives are good, intensification, right, more transit, right, all these things are good, but we're putting so much pressure on relatively small areas that we're getting kickback and resistance when there's all these other areas what we're saying, no, they're off limits. It's I'd like to see people start talking about that in a much more serious fashion. That wasn't a question. That was just me. I do this.
All I can say is I agree. I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that we're coming up on the half hour mark. I'm going to say we're probably going to wrap it up in a couple minutes because we've taken up half hour of your time so far, Mike. We very much appreciate it. But I do want to leave you with the last word because the goal of this episode was to educate and inform viewers free from party platforms and whatnot. And I guess if you may put on your professor hat a bit, and if there's somebody listening and they're going to be going to an all candidates meeting in the coming weeks, and this is an issue that is really passionate about, and they really want this to be addressed, can you maybe give them some pointers about what they should be not asking of the candidates, but maybe what should they be wanting to hear from their candidates when the answers are given?
Yeah, well, I think the big thing I would ask about is the sort of supply issue. That it's really easy to come up with sort of tax credits to incent things, but questions around, well, look, in my neighborhood, that there are 3 or 5 or however many bidders for every house, and the houses are going 15 to 20% over asking because there's so shortage. What are you going to do to increase the amount of housing in our community, but do so in a way that's climate friendly and family friendly? Because that's the important thing as well. We're not, I'm certainly not advocating that we just pave over the province and create sprawl. And I'm certainly not advocating that the only thing we build is 600 square foot condos that you can't raise a family in. I think we need some of those because we have a lot of 20 somethings and we have a lot of retired people who often like those as options. But we need places that are climate friendly and that you would actually want to raise a family in. So that would be the big thing I would be pressing on them. Like, how are we going to ensure we have those things to keep up with Ontario or Canada's growing population?
Good to hear. Well, I think we'll leave it at that for this week, Mike. So thank you very much, Mike, for coming on. And we will be probably following up on this. I bet we'll have you on for the next provincial election, whenever that happens.
There we go. When is that? I think we're May 2022.
Yeah, I think so.
Coming up
soon. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.